Alrighty, can everyone hear me all right? It's good to see so many faces already familiar and not. So I'm excited to welcome you all to this event. We're going to start, some folks will be trickling in, but we're going to get started, so for everyone's time. Just a brief introduction of myself. My name is Simona Capizani. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at Princeton in the Climate Futures Initiative, both postdoc in the Center for Human Values and also the High Meadows Environmental Institute. And I'm also the co-director of the Mentoring Initiative at the International Society for Environmental Ethics, along with my co-organizer of this event, Marian Hordequin. And we are super excited to invite you. This is our second inaugural webinar series supported for the Mentoring Initiative. And I just wanted to start off with a quick land acknowledgement and introduction of my colleague, and then we'll turn it over to introducing the panel. So for those of you that don't know, I am currently located in Princeton and currently delivering these marks on territory which the university has been occupying, an ancient homeland and traditional territories of the Lenni Lenape people. And the presence and resilience of this community continues to this day here. So I wanted to take an opportunity to recognize both the histories of violence and oppression and erasure and forced displacement, and also land theft that are central also to the crisis related to some of the issues we're going to be discussing today, but also wanted to affirm the sovereignty of the Lenape and other Indigenous caretakers of these lands and waters here, as well as the elders who have lived here before and folks that are self-recognized who no longer remain in these lands. As you know, we'll be discussing, climate justice is requiring us to take necessary measures to ensure full participation and support and sovereignty and leadership of marginalized communities and Indigenous folks. And we want to be able to amplify and implement certain mitigation and adaptation efforts and activities that communities have been doing and will continue to be contributing. So wanting to recognize that this is an ongoing project and multiple voices needing to be included in this. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Marian Hordequin, who's going to be taking it on from here. Marian joins us from Colorado College and is also the president now of International Society for Environmental Ethics and my co-director for the Mentoring Initiative. So Marian, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so again, my name is Marian Hordequin. I'm a philosophy professor at Colorado College. I'm vice president and president-elect of International Society for Environmental Ethics. So I'll be taking up the presidency starting in January. And I wanted to start off by thanking our partners and sponsors who helped to organize and support this webinar. So this webinar is sponsored by the Princeton Climate Futures Initiative and the High Meadows Environmental Institute in partnership with Public Philosophy Network and International Society for Environmental Ethics. As Simona mentioned, it's one of the webinars that's being offered in conjunction with the IC Mentoring and Peer Networking Initiative, which aims to provide support and resources for graduate students, early career scholars, and scholars throughout their careers whose research and teaching connect with environmental ethics. We have web resources on teaching, and we're working to develop some networking opportunities through Slack with the mentoring program, in addition to webinars like this. And more details about the mentoring initiative can be found on the IC website. And I think Simona will put a link to that webpage in the chat. All right, so without further ado, we want to move on to our panel. I'm going to say a little bit about the structure of the event. And I'll mention who our panelists are, and then we'll do more detailed introductions before each person speaks. So we're really thrilled and grateful to have with us today three wonderful people. Dr. Nancy Tuana from Penn State University, who's a philosopher there. And Dr. Deborah McGregor from York University, who's in the law school there, and Dr. Robert Hockett, who's at Cornell University, also in the law school. All these speakers, I think, have a lot to offer on the topic at hand, climate ethics in the field, thinking about interdisciplinary and normative perspectives as they relate to climate policy, climate science, climate responses. So the basic structure of the event today will be 3 short presentations, but one from each panelist, about 10 to 12 minutes. Then we'll turn it over to some questions from Simona and me, the moderators, just a few. And then we'll leave the remaining time for questions from the audience. So there should be a fair bit of time for audience questions and conversation. And we will remind you again when it comes time for the Q&A. But what we'll ask you to do is to type into the chat question if you have a question and you'd like to ask it out loud. If you prefer that we read your question, you can actually type your question directly into the chat and we'll read it for you. We'll manage the queue and try to get as many questions in as we can. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it back to Simona, who will introduce Nancy Tawana, who's our first panelist.
Thank you, Marian. So I'm excited to introduce Professor Tawana, who is the DuPont class of 1949 professor of philosophy and women and gender and sexuality studies at Penn State. She is a philosopher of science and feminist science studies theorist who specializes in issues of ethics and science. And the founding director of the Rock Ethics Institute. Her research addresses ethical and epistemic issues in the field of climate science. And she served as a co-PI on the NSF Sustainability Research Network and Sustainability Climate Risk Management. So Professor Tawana is also engaged in research on justice issues in the context of climate change and is the author of a number of articles on the topic of gender and climate change. So we're really excited to welcome her. I will turn the mic over to you, Professor Tawana.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll share my screen. When I think about what it is to do climate ethics in the field, the way in which I describe what I do is to use the phrase being an embedded philosopher in the practice of science. And I see myself as an embedded philosopher in the work that I'm going to be talking about today. Well over a decade ago, I started working with a number of climate scientists here at Penn State. And I brought to them the somewhat audacious idea that the work of philosophers in identifying values, both the values of stakeholders, but also the values of the scientists themselves, typically epistemic values, would lead to better science. And in fact, as a result of the work that we've done together, we've been able to show that that indeed is the case. So what do I mean by attention to values? What do I mean by being an embedded philosopher? In order to explain this, I'm going to talk about New Orleans. As you know, in 2005, New Orleans got hit by 2 devastating hurricanes, Katrina initially and then followed very quickly by Rita, which caused devastating flooding to the city. I was part of a scientific team that worked to assist people, the city of New Orleans, in trying to determine how best to adapt to the kinds of issues they were facing. And that was the NSF-funded Sustainable Climate Risk Management Network, or as we referred to ourselves, SCRIM. SCRIM functioned around a central question, and that question was, what are sustainable, scientifically sound, technologically feasible, economically efficient, and ethically defensible climate risk management strategies? Now, in order to answer that question, in order to do this kind of work, we committed ourselves to the view that attention to values would be a central component of that research. In other words, the philosophical work of examining values became central to the whole ethos of the team. Not just something we did on the side that some of us did, but something that became infused into the entire structure of the team and of the research. So let me explain this a little through a simple example. When you're working in New Orleans, the levees are really important. And one decision that you have to deal with is how much to raise the levees. As you know, with those two hurricanes, the levees failed. They were both overtopped, and there were systematic failures in some of the levees. And the decision about how much to raise the levees, how much to strengthen them, depends and hinges on predictions. And for that, you need science. You need to know what types of sea level rise the city is likely to be facing based on different types of climate futures. You need to know probabilities of intensities of storm surges because of warming ocean waters and more intensity of those hurricanes that are inevitably going to come up through the Gulf. But those decisions often depend as much on values, on what the people in the city of New Orleans want to protect and why they want to protect it. So basically what this means is that, as my colleague Klaus Keller, the scientist that I work most closely with and I've worked the longest with, the way he phrases it is, look, we have to get the science right. And that's what NSF wants. They want us to get the science right. But that alone isn't enough. We also have to get the right science. We have to we have to be able to bring to stakeholders the knowledge that they need in order to make the decisions that they want. And in order to do that, values are fundamental to decision making and to decision analysis. Because if the scientists solve a problem and work on a problem that doesn't matter to the stakeholders, then they're really not advancing the work that they want to do with decision support. So, what does it mean in doing this kind of science to do it in the field? What is climate ethics in the field? Well, one of the fields we work in is the field of stakeholder engagement. So this is a picture of some of the members of the team in New Orleans in part of the process of talking to stakeholders. And what we learned in talking to stakeholders, and one of the things we were committed to, is getting a diversity of stakeholders and trying to get a broadly representative group of stakeholders, was that people in New Orleans were very much concerned about risk to lives, but they were equally concerned about protecting the most vulnerable. They were concerned about what we call distributive justice. If you remember all the news reports from the aftermaths of Katrina and Rita, what we saw displayed sort of in shocking detail was the way in which the impacts of those storms disproportionately impacted the poorest members of the city, and the ways in which poverty and race were often interconnected in New Orleans. So those people most impacted were the members of the Black community who didn't have the financial means to leave the city, to be able to address the concerns that were needed. But we found out some other things too that were really interesting. I won't read off all of these, but ones that we found to be really interesting was attention to sense of place. So, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. So this is one of the fields we work in, but it's not the only field that I work in as an embedded philosopher. The other field is the field of the scientists. And again, these are some of the scientists who were key members of the team in SCRIM. And that field has its own values. usually epistemic values, values like robustness and predictive power, but they also are making epistemic decisions about how to deal with uncertainty quantification and which models to select. And if you don't align the values in this field with the values in the other field, then the process breaks down. And that's one of the roles of the embedded philosophers, is to try to make sure that the connections between these two fields work well together. And this is a simple design of one representation of some of the work we did that's recently published by a number of the team players that I work with. And what you see from this is that we looked at the various different values that we're finding with our engagement with stakeholders. Those are the little colored dots: sense of place, distributive justice, economic efficiency, safety. And we align them with different choices that can be made in terms of what you can do to adapt to hurricanes, to sea level rise, to the kinds of exposure and vulnerability that you find in this city of New Orleans. And what we found were two things. One, people wanted that levee system hardened. They wanted it improved, but they wanted it improved in ways that protected the least well off, maybe more than the rest of the community. They wanted it to attention to what communities got the most protection, because that was one of the problems that the city had been facing. But they also wanted certain historical places protected. There were various historical places, various historical monuments and buildings that are very important to the ethos of the city of New Orleans. And so they wanted the levee to protect those as well. But in addition, they wanted resilience, and resilience they saw as best offered through strengthening education for everyone in the community, but also to address issues like being able to get out of the city. One of the problems was many of the people were unable to evacuate. And so they wanted to address other adaptation strategies in addition to the levee, such as transportation possibilities. So that gives you a tiny snapshot, but to give you a little deeper dive into some of what we do, into the complexities of what we do, when I say make values a central component of the research, one is definitely to determine what it is that the stakeholders' values are and what their objectives are. But mind you, don't assume that they're going to be homogeneous. Sometimes stakeholders disagree. And it's also important to try to determine how they rank values, what's most important to them. But then we also have to figure out what's the best science for addressing those values. Now, in doing that, a very common question is, what are the gaps? What are the gaps between stakeholder knowledge and scientific knowledge? So, for example, there might be things that don't come up on the stakeholder value list, in part because there's knowledge that they don't have. And if they had that knowledge, that might affect their values. And so that's a very important gap analysis, and many gap analyses often stop there. But what we realized is it had to go the other way too. And that is, are there gaps in what the experts know that the stakeholders have? Do they have knowledge and that needs to be shared with the analysts, with the scientists? The question that keeps me up at night, and the question we've been trying to deal with in the research team, is what if the scientists' values are in tension with the stakeholder values? So a lot of models aggregate impacts, for example. But a lot of times stakeholders don't want impacts aggregated. They want to attend to who's going to be the most impacted by events, and they want to be able to make sure that those who are the least well off are the most protected. And thus you can have a mismatch between the scientific models and the knowledge that the stakeholders want to know. So we've taken the work that we've done and we're moving to a new location. We have a new grant. Some of us from SCRIM are part of this grant. I am and a few others. And we're moving now to the eastern coast, the northern eastern coast. And again, looking at risk management, primarily due to sea level rise and storm surges in a number of northern cities. And this is MOC, a new NSF grant, and bringing our knowledge from what we learned in SCRIM, we have this particular model of what we're doing. And once again, you see the ways in which values and ethics are deeply embedded into the work of the scientific team, where the values enable us to determine what decision analyses we engage in so that the decision analysis matches the decision problem, so that what we do in this team can be co-produced with stakeholders to make sure that we are bringing to them the knowledge they need to do what decisions matter to them. And that means it's an iterative process. It's one that has to happen multiple times. You can't just go and ask stakeholders what they value, because what they value may change as they learn certain things, as sometimes the decision problem shifts as we start to see, oh, we're going to be getting a lot more coastal inundation because of sea level rise. It also can shift because of suggestions and adaptation information that's being brought back from the scientific team to the stakeholders. So it's a process that has to be deeply iterative. And as you can see from this, is a somewhat complex figure, but if you notice the fields on the right-hand side, it's also a deeply transdisciplinary practice. So I hope that gives you a little taste of the work that we do and what it means when I say, let's go do climate ethics in the field. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tawana. It is super exciting to hear about this continued work, and hopefully we'll be able to hear a little bit more once we get to the Q&A. So I'm going to turn to introducing Professor McGregor. Professor McGregor is an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous and Environmental Justice at York University. Her research focuses on Indigenous knowledge systems, their various applications in diverse contexts, including water and environmental governance, environmental justice, forest policy and management, and sustainable development. Professor McGregor, who is Anishinaabe from the Whitefish River First Nation, has shared her work through the Indigenous Environmental Justice Project at York, has served as a member of Canada's Assembly of First Nations Advisory Committee on Climate Action and the Environment. And we're very excited to have her. And I believe we're welcoming you back because you were here recently, I think last year, or earlier on in the year. So thank you for coming, and we're excited to hear you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for joining us, whether it's morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world. So thank you, Nancy, for your remarks. Lots to think about there, and for this invitation. So I'm going to share my screen and try to make sense of the so many things that are going through my mind about what to think about, because COP's going on right now. So there's just so much media and so many ways you can think about climate ethics, and I frame it around climate justice. So here we go. So I wanted to start with this image. So my starting place, like when I think about being in the field, like literally like out there in the field. So when I think about Indigenous peoples where I come from, or even the acknowledgement that was given before we started the session, Indigenous peoples have been here for thousands of years and interacted with each other as nations. We're complete societies. And that's actually really, for me as an Anishinaabe, actually most of my history. Colonization is relatively recent. It's been devastating for sure. but really that's most of our history. So we had our own laws, we had our own governance, knowledge systems, protocols for how we would live with, in English, we would say all of creation. And our concept of that is quite broad. It includes our ancestors. Are we honoring our ancestors, future generations, spirit world, for lack of a better word? So we've always been here. And oops, I'm not sure. I don't think.
Yeah, I paused at 6:30.
Oh.
Professor McGregor, you are muted. I think.
Oh, for some reason I got muted. Okay, so yeah, I was going to say if it were me, that noise, it would be a dog barking in the background, but so you're spared that so far. So the way that I approach thinking about climate ethics in the field from an Indigenous perspective is the impacts are felt holistically, like it's felt in everyday life in people's lives. It's not siloed. So part of the work I do is I also sit on the Institute of Climate Solutions on an adaptation panel in Canada. It's a think tank around trying to figure out what climate solutions can be. I'm now appointed to the panel or advisory committee that's going to be developing the National Adaptation Panel. And so what I find is that the approach is very siloed. And I've also engaged in climate assessments for IPCC and also nationally in Canada. And so what happens is, okay, we're going to now look at, could you tell me what the risk and vulnerability is of Indigenous people? And I'm like, okay, I can do that. And then we're going to look at monitoring, which is a whole separate thing altogether. And then we're going to look at adaptation, maybe resilience, and maybe mitigation. So they're very siloed, but people don't experience that way in their lives. They experience it very, for lack of a better word, holistically, like it's all impacting every aspect of somebody's life. But ironically, in the field, when people are on the land or on the ice, whatever the nature of the relationships are with the land, all of those aspects of the silos that I talked about are engaged. But people aren't, like if you go to my community and to say, what are your mitigation strategies? People are like, what? Like that doesn't make any sense, because that's very much external, right? Kind of being imposed, and people come in and study Indigenous peoples around these different areas. The other thing that I noticed, and Nancy talked about this, is there's major knowledge gaps. I'm in these spaces as an Indigenous scholar, and recently we were looking at an infrastructure report, and I said, why aren't we looking at like infrastructure for water in First Nation communities? Because it's basically a water crisis in Canada in many of these communities. And they said, well, we don't have the data on that. So then we're not even proposing adaptation or resilient solutions because we don't have the data on that. And I think part of it is because it's not being looked at in the way that Nancy described. It's very siloed. So this is sort of like the reality I find of Indigenous communities. And what I've been trying to propose in my research is that Indigenous peoples actually want to govern their own impacts, because the way that it's playing out in Canada and elsewhere is generally we're contributing to other people's assessments, we're contributing to other people's governance, we're contributing to everybody else's stuff, and we don't get to form what these mean for ourselves. So hopefully I'll be able to convey that. You can see that I get quite excited being in these spaces, but I'm also very frustrated in a lot of these spaces when I'm told, I want this question answered, we don't have the data. And basically this means if we weren't asking the right questions 3, 2, or 10 years ago, we don't have it now. So this work becomes really important to engage philosophy or the social sciences. And there was recently a report published in 2020, and they looked at the kind of research that was published since, I think, the 1950s. And it was 770 more times of the natural sciences and technical solutions, and not so much in the social science and humanities. So there's a huge gap period in looking at this. So hopefully, this panel tonight sort of simulates some different kind of questions in research. This image is just essentially to point out that in the work that I do in Indigenous knowledge systems, we actually have stories that I would consider to be climate change stories. This is what happens when people don't behave properly in relation to the natural world. And I don't have time to tell the stories, but sometimes, such an unpopular thing to say, sometimes people aren't smart enough, and we rely on the natural world to inform us. And now I guess maybe that's being framed as all the rage now, nature-based solutions, but that's another story. So I did want to point that out, that within Indigenous societies, because we've dealt with dramatic change, we have knowledge around how to adapt and how to survive and what we need to do that. Living well in responsibilities, what I really wanted to convey here, because this is research that's becoming, that people are pursuing, is what we know is that Indigenous peoples caretake, for lack of a better word, some people say manage, govern, 20% of the world's land mass, but that's where 80% of the biodiversity is. So that kind of tells you something about Indigenous peoples, their caretaking and their knowledge. And that's also where Indigenous languages are spoken. So like, I'm in so many circles, climate circles, in the Canadian context, and sometimes in the US tribe context, if I'm invited to different conferences and workshops there, is that we're language doesn't come up that often. So when I'm in these spaces and saying, like, retention and revitalization of Indigenous languages is an important climate strategy, that's over a lot of people's heads. They don't know what that has to do with anything to do with climate justice. So we're all familiar with this very bad news. But really what a lot of these, what I call disaster reports, call for is transformation. They've all called for that. And that hasn't happened. What's happened is a tweaking of the business as usual, tweaking of the status quo. We haven't got that transformation. And so we need to have these different disciplines and ideas and creativity to try to get us to this transformation. That the techno-scientific fix hasn't generated that. So we need to engage with other ways of thinking and asking these questions to sort of get us to this, to imagine it at something different in our world in the future that we're looking for. So in the context that I'm in, the other word other than carbon is colonialism, and that freaks people out. They don't know what that has to do with climate justice. They don't know what that has to do with climate change. But that's the context of climate justice and ethics in the Canadian context, and as far as I understand, also in the United States as well. So this has to be acknowledged. And a lot of these spaces, I find myself always having to explain the history of Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous relations when I actually want to contribute to the discussion, because a lot of people just simply, they don't know how it's related. Some of the assumptions that I often lay out, and this is drawing actually upon Kyle White's work. And so he is now at Michigan University, and he was in philosophy at Michigan State. I really respect his like, he's got imagination, like he's imagining a different kind of the questions we need to ask ourselves and what that future can kind of look like. So essentially, Indigenous peoples, as we know, have already endured centuries of massive environmental change and have been severely impacted, yet here we are. So there's something to learn from Indigenous peoples about how to adapt and survive and transform through these massive changes. So it's actually not new. Sometimes the way I look at it is, again, is probably not like the nicest thing to say. As I said, everyone else is now facing what Indigenous peoples have faced for centuries. And we want to contribute to these broader conversations, but often find ourselves on the outside looking in. So, and often that becomes advocacy and activism, and that doesn't like translate necessarily to policy and adaptation strategies and in this trying to input into the broader realm. But that's the position you're in when you're on the outside looking in and not able to contribute in the way that you would like. So some of my work focuses on the voices we don't hear. Women oftentimes. In Canada, we had the Murdered, Missing, and Indigenous Women's report with 94 calls to justice. So that also, women are impacted differently. Nancy can probably speak to this better than I can in some of her work in feminist studies, make different kind of climate decisions. So I try to focus in my work on the voices that we don't often hear and the way that they want to tell it, if at all possible. And this is just from the Beijing Declaration of Indigenous Women, because essentially, from what I can tell from the work that I do, Indigenous peoples have been calling what we're seeing playing out now for centuries. And you see this in the international Indigenous declarations. But really, again, pointing here to our laws and to our relationships with the earth. because it seems like the current governance structures and laws aren't delivering on moving us to this transformation in a different direction. And I think the Code Red 2021 IPCC report kind of pointed that out. So what does that mean in terms of the work that I do? So I think we need to engage with very different knowledge systems, actually multiple knowledge systems. How do we do that? What's the ethical frameworks for doing that? Because a lot of the times it's not done ethically. It's an extraction from Indigenous communities, stick it somewhere else and hope for the best. Nobody's happy with that. But really how we survived through all these, through colonialism and other processes was our own knowledge systems and our own laws. It was our own traditions that got us out of this. In 1996, a commission report on Indigenous peoples was released, and their main finding was that colonial and later Canadian government solutions for Indians, they said at the time, were wrong. They're not able to figure out what that solution is. It was our own, it was from ourselves and our own knowledge and our own traditions that enable us to be able to survive. And it's going to continue to do so. This is just an image based on some work I did with elders and youth about what is our climate future going to look like? What do we need? Again, speaking to languages, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous laws, trying to connect back to the land, revitalizing those land-based activities that have been disrupted through colonial processes, imagining what our own solutions can be, as opposed to just, contributing to other people's, which is important. I would never say that it's not. I'm in circles where elders are saying, okay, they're not getting it. They really kind of need our perspective. But we also need to come up with our own, if we understand ourselves to be nations and societies and communities that want to govern what's going to be happening to us, as opposed to responding and reacting to other people's ideas, then you put so much energy into that as opposed to doing what you need to do. The other, what I want to point out here from these youth is they talked about love in these conversations. And those of you maybe heard me say this before, it never comes up in the Institute for Climate Choices. It never comes up in these other spaces. I had a student go through all the IPCC reports and say, can you find this anywhere? And it's not there, but it's so central to how we understand moving forward with our climate solutions. And I don't know exactly what they are yet, but I do know they have to do with our knowledge, language, traditions, and governance, and trying to articulate those and figure out how they could be shared more broadly, ethically, in an ethical framework. In Canada, we're calling that an ethical, we're actually trying to figure out how to develop that kind of ethical framework where different knowledge systems come together in recognition that we're talking about unequal power relations as well. So that's a challenge to do. So again, Earth, Language, and Identity came out. This came out from the youth, came out from elders, and I try to take my direction from the communities I work with. And plus I live in one. I live in my communities, my family, relatives, and future generations. And this is what they talked about. So a lot of the work that I do tries to respond to what's been identified as priorities for me. So our future, love in the earth, planetary health. So this is a picture of my 2-year-old niece in our sugar bush. So these are the questions we ask ourselves in the work that we do. Do we love our future generations? Is our work contributing to the benefit of future generations so that they could live well? And what kind of ancestor do we want to be? So when people look back, like I can look back on my ancestors and they enabled me to be here through what they did. And what kind of ancestor am I going to be to enable future generations to live well with the earth? So miigwech, sorry, that went a little bit faster, but hopefully my main ideas were conveyed, and looking forward to discussion and hearing from Robert. So chimiigwech, everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor McGregor. And I think it's a really ripe opportunity here to have this discussion on how to have this larger sort of conversation about the power dynamics as we're constructing these ethical frameworks. So it's nice to hear how, and to get the insight on how you're grappling with that. So hope to hear a little bit more in the Q&A. I'm gonna introduce our next speaker. I'm super excited to have Professor Robert Hockett with us. He's the Edward Cornell Professor of Law at Cornell University. the author of Financing the Green New Deal, A Plan of Action and Renewal, and most recently the co-author along with Professor Aaron James of Money for Nothing. He's an expert on law and economics, and his work is concerned with the legal and institutional prerequisites to a just, prosperous, and sustainable economic order. So Professor Hockett has consulted for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the International Monetary Fund, Americans for Financial Reform, the Occupy Cooperative, and a number of federal and state legislators and local governments. And he's played a key role in the development of proposed legislation for the Green New Deal and has worked with AOC's team. So we're super excited to welcome him with us. Take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Simona. And thanks so much to Nancy and Deborah as well for this absolutely inspiring presentation. It's a great honor to be on the same panel with you guys. I think maybe the best way I can add a little something here is maybe by drawing attention to a somewhat rare ethical opportunity that both the Green New Deal initiative on the one hand and the Building Back Better initiative, which is a kind of rebranding of the Green New Deal, on the other hand, present us with, which is part of what has attracted me to involvement in both right from the get-go. So we're all, I think, relatively familiar with some of the more sort of standard approaches to dealing with climate change, and in particular with the carbon dissemination throughout the world's atmosphere, and the kind of the ethics as well as the sort of policy pragmatics of the familiar approaches are probably just as familiar as are those approaches, right? So the old idea of taxing carbon emission or reliance on carbon taxation, a perfectly respectable and venerable idea, and a perfectly sort of intelligible one too, from a sort of ethical point of view. The intuition being basically, you know, if you're the one adding this pollutant, then you're the one who ought to be made to internalize some of this cost that you're currently externalizing on everybody else. And then if we think in terms of something like cap and trade, which is another form of proposal that's fairly familiar, I suppose you can think of that as a kind of a graft onto carbon taxation, whereby we enjoy certain efficiency or productivity benefits that come by essentially allowing those who are more efficient producers to kind of basically sell their sort of quota rights when it comes to emitting to those who are less efficient, thereby sort of cushioning the blow, I suppose, of the transition, and also, again, enabling a certain continued efficiency of production consistent with the gradual reduction of the quantum of carbon in the atmosphere. But those, again, those are fine, and I certainly wouldn't want to sort of be dismissive of those efforts or of those who continue to push along those lines. But what is especially exciting about the Green New Deal and Building Back Better, from my point of view at least, is that it offers some additional opportunities, again, ethical opportunities and actual accomplishment opportunities, you might say, that we haven't had in quite some time, maybe not since the original New Deal, that is, of course, part of the Green New Deal's namesake. So to begin with, the sort of guiding vision, or our guiding vision in putting together the Green New Deal, was the thought that, well, perhaps the general public in the US at least is finally ready to sort of countenance the need to revamp entirely the US nation's infrastructural base, right? Basically to sort of rebuild or start over again, or start from scratch, or sort of transform basically all of those public goods on which private goods production sort of rely. So transportation networks, power networks, water networks, all those, again, sort of classic infrastructural goods on which economic activity tends to depend, are sort of widely recognized in the US by people on the political right and the political left to be in a fairly shabby state of repair at this point, and probably in need of, again, sort of systematic and comprehensive renewal or revival. Now, given that fact, right, given that data point, assuming that it is in fact a data point, our thought in kind of cooking up the Green New Deal was that we could actually piggyback appreciable environmental transformation on that very fact, on that very basis. The basic idea was that if you're going to revamp or replace a bunch of existing infrastructures, you're presumably going to want to replace them with state-of-the-art infrastructures, again, irrespective of what side of the political aisle you might be on. And it just so happens that state-of-the-art infrastructures now are increasingly green infrastructures, right? I mean, a sort of caricatured way of making the point would be to say, you know, we don't manufacture kerosene lamps anymore. We don't use whale oil lamps any longer. So if you're replacing a lighting system, you're probably replacing it not with something where you're burning things, but with something that's rather more environmentally friendly. And likewise, of course, it doesn't take much seriously deep digging or deep diving to see that nations' automotive infrastructures outside of North America in particular are very rapidly transitioning to electric vehicles or EVs rather than fossil fuel burning vehicles and the like. So you see where this is going. The idea was that if we can sort of, again, kind of lever the sort of general understanding among right-wingers and left-wingers and centrists alike that the infrastructure as a whole requires revamping, then we can, in a sense, kind of sneak in through the back door, as it were, just via the fact that new infrastructures tend to be more environmentally friendly when they're state-of-the-art, a kind of steady greenification of the infrastructure of the United States, maybe of the entire world, insofar as the rest of the world gets on board with Green New Deal activities as well, and that will enable us then to proceed rather rapidly, to move much more quickly than we've been able to do in more recent years and even decades when it comes to sort of rescuing the planet. Now, you can think of that, I suppose, as a kind of practical opportunity that we thought we would sort of take advantage of in order to bring about a more survivable planet. And there's presumably some ethical imperative in that itself, right, in rescuing the planet or preserving the planet against complete and utter destruction of all carbon-based life forms. But in addition, there was another sort of ethical opportunity, it seemed to us, or certainly seemed to me, that the Green New Deal thus framed would offer. And that is a kind of a not altogether common circumstance in which the interests of a sort of egalitarian or even prioritarian conception of distributive justice on the one hand, and a more sort of maximizing consequentialist ethic on the other hand, would actually converge, right? So that you wouldn't actually have to sort of settle accounts or decide between a maximizing utilitarian or consequentialist type ethic on the one hand and a more prioritarian or egalitarian ethic on the other. And that's owing to a fairly straightforward fact, which will hardly be surprising to most of you here, and certainly not to Nancy or to Deborah. Nancy, by the way, I grew up in New Orleans, and so I think I was made somewhat sensitive to what I'm about to say fairly early on. But that is the unsurprising fact that the greatest degrees of environmental degradation and the most sort of choking quantities of pollutants tend to accumulate in areas that are inhabited by people who have been traditionally marginalized or exploited or otherwise unjustly done by historically. So here in the US, that means largely Aboriginal communities, African-American communities, other communities of color, also sort of forgotten so-called backwater rural areas as well in some cases. In particular, of course, in our beloved Senator Joe Manchin's beloved state of West Virginia, which of course is a coal disaster. But now, on the one hand, while that is, of course, an absolute moral and ethical outrage, it is, on the other hand, an interesting opportunity against the backdrop of the Green New Deal effort, as I've sort of framed it or tried to characterize it. And it's fairly simple to sort of make the case, or fairly easy to make the case. The basic idea is that if you want to sort of get a lot of bang for the buck right from the get-go, right out of the gates, when it comes to beginning the Green New Deal greenification effort, it makes pretty good sense, doesn't it, to start in the worst polluted and the hardest hit areas. Partly because, of course, those are the areas that are most deserving of it, and most, owed it, you might say, by the rest of it, by the rest of us. But also because if you're trying to sort of convince people who really aren't motivated by justice concerns or aren't moved by justice concerns, but who care only about GDP growth or economic growth or sort of softening the putative economic blow of an infrastructural transformation, the easiest way to assuage them is to say, oh, look at all of this growth that is now occurring, all of this beneficial economic growth that's occurring as a result of the first efforts that we're making pursuant to the Green New Deal. And the way you get that sort of growth bang for the buck at the front end is, again, precisely by starting with those areas of the country that have been most blighted and that are most lacking at the moment in productive opportunity. So if we start, in other words, in the Gary, Indianas, and in the West Virginias, and the various other parts of the country that have tended to be, that are, first of all, most in need of a lot of abatement work, and second of all, are very much in need of the coming of economic opportunities and productive opportunities in particular. If we start with those, we are both then doing the kind of prioritarian thing, we're sort of doing the egalitarian thing, and we're also doing, I think, the most efficient form of maximizing thing. And that's a way then of securing buy-in on the one hand from progressive forces, which are the people I'm most concerned with getting buy-in from, but also from at least some folk who might ordinarily not have been altogether sympathetic to the effort that we're trying to put forward with the Green New Deal, had we framed it, or had we been stuck with framing it solely as an environmental initiative rather than also being an infrastructural renewal initiative. Now, a final point in connection with the Green New Deal that I think is of special ethical significance or interest as well, and then a quick couple of remarks about Building Back Better, which is, again, a kind of partial rebranding, I think, of the Green New Deal. So the other, I think, ethically interesting or salient thing about the Green New Deal initiative, at least as we've been pushing it since late 2018, and then, or let's say mid 2018 on into early 2019, when we put out the resolution on February 7th of 2019, is the opportunity that it also opens up for a much more participatory form of democracy here in the US, which, as you know, is a country that of late has not been, where participatory democracy has not been altogether abundantly available. But part of the sort of next stage in the Green New Deal effort that we on the progressive side of the Democratic Party here in the US have been planning to roll out is what we call, or what we've been tentatively calling, the Green New Deal wish list project. So the idea here was to hold town hall meetings in lots of cities and towns all over the country, partly with the sponsorship of the city councils or the town councils of these localities, and partly with the collaborative effort of the Sunrise Movement and the Democratic Socialists of America and a few other groups, essentially to have large town meetings, multiple town meetings, in fact, where essentially what we do is we tell the participants, imagine that $10 billion were going to be coming your way from the federal government to be spent on environmental abatement projects and sort of green-friendly infrastructure projects that you have not had the funding for up to this point. What would your top choices? What would your principal priorities be? What do you view as the most urgent infrastructural needs in your communities or in the region or in the area more broadly speaking? And the idea was to essentially collect or put together long lists of these perceivedly most urgent project needs in various localities across the country, put it all together in one big binder and call this essentially the Green New Deal wish list. And then as specific projects, specific Green New Deal projects, were formulated at the federal level, they would be formulated partly through the information derived from these particular wish lists, and that would be essentially, again, a way of making the Green New Deal a kind of grassroots thing and not merely a top-down thing. And that would enable us then to lever, you might say, the comparative strengths in a kind of classic subsidiarist way of localities on the one hand and federal governance on the other, right? So the comparative advantage of the federal government is, of course, the coordination, the sort of assurance that you don't have sort of efforts occurring at sort of cross purposes, and also, of course, the financing capacity of the U.S. federal government, which is virtually, well, we don't know what the limit is. It's sort of practically limitless, you might say, whereas the strength of the localities are more informational and more sort of, there's more sort of awareness as to what the most urgent needs are in particular communities. So this would be a way of sort of making good on the original promise of what Americans sort of idiosyncratically call federalism, but which most of the rest of the world calls subsidiarity. That takes me to a final observation, again, having to do with building back better. So as I've noted, building back better, as I've encountered it so far, through some advisory work that I've been able to do on the part of or for certain legislators in Congress, as well as some executive offices of the Biden administration right now, really does seem to be meant to be something very much like the Green New Deal. The motivating considerations seem to be quite similar, but the marketing savvy might be a little bit better in the sense that by not emphasizing the green, by letting the green sort of take care of itself, and by emphasizing the building or the infrastructural piece of the Green New Deal instead, as captured by the term, building, or the phrase building back, I think that building back better is less likely to be sort of viewed by centrists or right-wingers as some sort of would-be socialist takeover. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But in that sense, it's a sort of savvy marketing relabeling, I think, although it's intriguingly a label that was taken from the World Bank, which I'm sure some right-wingers wouldn't be particularly pleased about. That said, I don't see the same commitment to sort of local input or to sort of grassroots town hall style meetings, or to the kinds of efforts that we associate with the Sunrise Movement that I have to confess I'm a member of, and that we might associate with some other sort of progressive democratic groups here in the US. And so in that sense, building back better, assuming that it happens, will be something of a sort of a humbling of, or a somewhat sort of glass 3/4 full rather than glass fully full version of the Green New Deal, unless maybe in a second Biden term, or in a term an administration that succeeds Biden's, we can sort of re-enliven the Green New Deal credentials of the Building Back Better plan. But maybe that will happen. But either way, it seems to me that by and large, we have the same sort of remarkable opportunity to advance the sort of ethical status of the American economy and American productive activity, insofar as we do push forward with Building Back Better, even if it is a kind of a slightly watered down version of the Green New Deal that we're mostly hoping for here on the left. And with that, I guess I'll pause and for now. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Professor Hockett, and to all our panelists. Yeah, just to note, it is concerning maybe about this lack of direct participatory, engagement commitment, but you still make me feel a little more hopeful than I was feeling last week. So I'm going to now proceed to turning over the mic to my co-organizer, Marian Hordigan. We have a couple of questions for the panelists that we've prepared, and then we want to be able to turn it over and have some questions from the Q&A. So without further ado, Marian.
Great. So yeah, thanks to all three panelists. I really enjoyed these talks, and they're sort of interestingly complementary to one another, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So we have a question for each of you, and I'll start with Professor Tuana. You've already addressed this a bit, but I wanted to invite you to expand. So could you say a bit more about some of the challenges and the opportunities that you've encountered as a philosopher engaging with natural science and natural scientists on climate change, and particularly in the current moment, where do you see value in this kind of engagement?
So the challenges are myriad. It depends on, sort of what perspective you want to look at. First of all, it really takes, it just takes more time to do this type of work. And that's always a tension with our graduate students and our postdocs, our early career faculty, because the results often are slower. They're, in my opinion, more important, but they just are slower. So there's sometimes a mismatch between the types of goals one expects, one is expected to have, both with scholarship, but even with the funding agencies. And it also often takes more time than stakeholders are looking for. I mean, we're not urban planners. One of the grants that I'm a part of that's dealing with riverine flooding in small towns in Pennsylvania, one of the things we realized was that our major cities are getting attention, but our small towns aren't. And so we've been doing this type of work with small towns, and they want answers. And we provide suggestions and opportunities for reflection, but ultimately the decisions have to be done by the stakeholders. So there's lots of different challenges. There's also challenges in terms of having the work count in the typical measures.
Great. Thanks so much for that. We can, I'm sure, talk more about some of these challenges as we go forward. So my next question is for Professor McGregor. And I have sort of two possible questions for you. I have the original one that I wrote down, and then I'll offer a second, and you can choose whether to answer the first, the second, or briefly touch on both. Okay. So you've worked to bring forward Indigenous environmental justice into broader discourses about environmental justice and climate justice. And you've also written about Indigenous knowledge systems. I wanted to invite you to say a little bit about what distinguishes Indigenous environmental justice from environmental justice more sort of broadly, and to speak about why Indigenous environmental justice perspectives and Indigenous epistemologies are particularly important in developing responses to climate change. You've already touched on some of those, so if you don't like that question, or the other question I had was kind of analogous to the question that I asked Professor Tuana. You talked about some of the challenges of navigating conversations between Indigenous communities and broader settler communities. And I was interested in your thoughts on sort of what are some of the barriers to partnering across those communities, and what kinds of partnerships have you seen as successful? What are the characteristics of successful partnerships between Indigenous and settler communities? So either of those questions, or briefly on both, whatever you prefer.
They're both great questions, and I'll start with the first one, because I really had to think about this when I when I applied for a job that said Indigenous environmental justice. Like, what did that mean? Because really nobody knew. So the exciting thing about that is you get to influence what that is. The unexciting thing or daunting thing is, what did I sign up for? And so what I ended up doing again is going back to Indigenous worldview, ontologies of the world, and what are the nature of our relationships, and how do we ensure, for lack of a better word, sustainable relations. So the way I understand environmental environmental justice as I trace the field. So it's relatively recent, I guess a few decades old, and concerned with very important things that Robert talked about and that Nancy talked about in terms of distributive justice, procedural justice, every other kind of injustice that we call justice for some reason. And that work absolutely needs to happen. Like there needs to be that kind of analysis to what's to what's happening out there in the real world. What made environmental justice really interesting too was it could also be it wasn't just something that was in the academic realm. It was actually something that could be part of movements and regular people and activists and everything else. But what I found as I tracked over time how it engaged with Indigenous peoples or Indigenous thought is that it knew there was something different there. Like there's sovereignty, there's the particular relationship that Indigenous peoples in Canada and the US have with the state, the fiduciary obligation, the trust. So there was all these other elements that didn't 100% fit into the environmental justice framework, even though there was so much that did, right? Like there's so much overlap, and there's a lot that's central to the both of them. So the way that it started to look to me was that it like trying to grapple with the distinctness of Indigenous realities was sort of integrated into environmental justice, and that's not a bad thing. Like to me, that's the kind of work that people do mobilized around that is critically important. But that wasn't the same as Indigenous environmental justice. So what is the center of what that would look like? So I go back to my own tradition when I think about the Anishinaabe thought around this. And really the centrality of our relationships. Again, our primary purpose is to support life. Like everything about our knowledge and laws is around that. And but in our worldview, we recognize, I guess, what other people would call the non-human as persons, and they also have rights and responsibilities. And we don't have, as humans, the right to interfere with their ability to live well. So when we contaminate water, we violated water's own rights. So I guess there's different kind of narratives that are kind of emerging around that now, like rights of nature, other kind of concepts that are emerging. But that became the central part of it is how do we live well with the non-human, for lack of a better word, or the more than human, however this is constructed. How do we not interfere with their also ability to be able to live well? And this is actually embedded in a lot of in how we think. So actually just earlier this week, yesterday morning, I was working with students in my class around the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address, because it actually lays out this is what we think about in terms of our relationships to the natural world. These are our responsibilities. These are the responsibilities of the moon and the water. So it's a very expanded idea of what we understand environment to be. So it includes the four beings, it includes the moon and the sun, which is not in federal definition of environment at all. So it's a much expanded view. So I guess if I were to describe it, it would be like a Venn diagram where there's a lot that's in common, and there's important collaborations that need to happen in order to hopefully change our reality in terms of injustice. But there's also some things that are very distinct in Indigenous environmental justice, and it would come from Indigenous laws. Like our laws basically speak to our duties, obligations, and responsibilities to each other in the natural world. That's essentially what they are, and our knowledge systems and our governance. So they come from this different place. But having said that, they're important, and there's a lot to collaborate on in thinking about that. So that's sort of where I landed with that, and I'm applying it to the Indigenous climate justice work that I do that others find useful. I'll just touch on the second question because it's really big, and I think probably one of the hardest things to do because of this history of colonization is trying to establish some kind of relationship. And the starting point for that a lot of the times is building the trust, because there's been so much, there's been a lot of sharing, but then there's been distrust. You're dealing with intergenerational trauma. People are living with injustice in their face every day. So to me, that's a big part of it, and kind of meeting people where they are. And then really taking seriously responsibilities to change, as opposed to just saying this is what you're going to do and then nothing happens, because that doesn't help the relationship. So I find the trust, building that trust is really important in starting that relationship. So, and there's all kinds, I suppose, different strategies for doing that. So in terms of where have collaborations gone well, I think it's when there's examples of this. We did a systematic review on how Indigenous knowledge systems form part of whatever we want to call it, environmental or resource management and governance. And it has to do with being able to come together. And usually it's project level. Like, it's harder to do this at different scales, where people can come together as equals as much as possible. And again, it's easier to do this in a project because you're not dealing with so much of the broader context of politics and everything else. And it's when people are willing to let go of some power because there's unequal power relationships. And that's really, really hard when it's so embedded in people's privilege to let some of that go. And recognize that you're not always going to agree. And how do you work through where you don't agree, especially when different experiences and knowledge systems come together and you bring the best that you have to solve a problem, but things always don't go perfectly. That's just the nature of relationships. And we've all been in relationships long enough to know that they all don't go perfectly. And it's the ability to be able to work through the tough stuff that really speaks to the strength of that relationship. So so there are examples of where it's gone really well, and usually it doesn't involve the assimilation of Indigenous knowledge. It's usually different conceptual frameworks are being employed. So the weaving of Indigenous knowledge systems, so drawing on the work of Ramit Kimmerer, or the braiding actually, she says. So they're maintaining their integrity because, as I said before, Indigenous peoples are complete societies. And we want to make the best decisions too. So we want the science too. So it's not like we're rejecting that. So what we need to have that too. So we want scientists and philosophers and everybody else to share the best knowledge that they have with us too. So there's a reciprocal kind of relationship there. So we can make the best possible decisions we can in our community. So there's no rejection of other knowledge. This is how they come together. And it's essentially how people are going to get along. That's kind of what it is in some of the examples that have gone well. I'll stop there. I talked way too much there.
It was really helpful. Thanks so much. And Simona, I think, has a question for Professor Hockett.
Yeah, I'm gonna, I think, mesh a couple questions that I had, one for the group, into asking you, Professor Hockett. So, and this might, I think you touched a bit on this in your talk, so maybe inviting you to expand a little bit. But we know that often, like, ethically grounded perspectives sometimes come in opposition to some of these economically grounded perspectives in debates over climate change. So you run up against economic realists, right, arguing that justice doesn't have a place in kind of climate policy. And obviously your work is really important in complicating, right, those kinds of frameworks. So the question that originally I was going to ask was how you were seeing ethics, economics, and policy working together in this space. But since you touched on that a little bit, I was wondering if you could actually say a little bit more on this sort of motivational challenge that we have regarding getting to 1.5. So, we know that there are these pathways, both economic and scientific. So it's not for a lack of capacity, but there's this challenge on the political will, which, you're very familiar with. And I was wondering if you could reflect or share a little bit about the role of our theorizing, our normative theorizing as academics, and how we should also be grappling with these motivational worries in our research, how to be doing the best political science or normative theorizing, knowing that we really have these, challenging feasibility frontiers when it comes to political will, and maybe how you've encountered that in your work facing this.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is, in some ways, this is a theoretical question, and in some ways it's a practical question. And one thing that I think makes me sort of optimistic is that this is a case where the theory and the practice, again, kind of converge. It's just that we haven't really, I don't think, framed things correctly up to this point. And part of the point of the Green New Deal initiative in the first place was to sort of change the framing. precisely along the lines that I'm going to suggest. So what we tend to think of is decarbonization or environmental abatement as costs, right? For whatever reason, we tend to account them as costs. We're told that we have to stop doing things that we've been doing up to this point. And so we're sort of talked to in the language of thou shalt nots, or even just any kind of shalt or shalt not. It's all sort of laid out kind of as if as though a law were being laid down. And so we're going to be constrained now either to refrain from doing things that we've gotten used to doing, or we're going to be constrained to start doing things that we're not of a mind to do and would prefer not to do. And that seems to me that sort of elicits almost an immediate sort of adolescent psychology reaction on the part of lots of people, like, you know, you're not the boss of me, or don't tell me what to do, or, you know, I'm doing just fine, thank you very much, I don't need your sort of laying the law down for me. A sort of a related tendency, I think, that a lot of people have with the traditional framings of the urgency of revitalizing the planet, is a kind of, you know, the sort of the whataboutism sort of reaction that, well, you know, wait a minute, doesn't China emit more than the United States and the European Union and India combined? What about them? You know, why aren't we, you know, we'll maybe think about doing something when you tell them to do something, right? And there's a lot of that as well. And again, it's not all that surprising. I mean, a lot of people do seem to be sort of adolescently minded, at least in the American electorate, and so if things are sort of framed that way, it's kind of predictable that the more sort of atavistic among us and the less sort of ethically minded among us are going to react in that way. But the problem is, well, I guess the opportunity here is that that's a sort of false framing at this point, right? There is this absolutely spectacular opportunity that we're now faced with to generate wealth. And I don't mean wealth in a kind of dollars and cents, kind of environmentally indifferent sense of wealth, or in a justice indifferent sense of wealth, or in a human health indifferent sense of wealth. I mean wealth in a fully inclusive sort of human health embracing, planetary health embracing, and material advantage embracing sense, right? You know, if you look at, again, I hate this is going to sound vaguely vulgar, but because I hate thinking in terms of things like GDP, but if we keep in mind for the moment that GDP is itself sort of neutral as between, it's just a measure of transaction volume, right? So what the transactions are in is again kind of blank for the moment. If you just bracket what the transactions in, and think of GDP as a measure of growth that is essentially measured by reference to transaction volume, and then you look back to the last great sort of infrastructural revitalization of the United States, which was during the 1930s and early 1940s. The wealth growth of the United States was absolutely immense, right? Not just against the baseline of the sort of decline activity of the Great Depression, but even against the baseline of the pre-Depression highs, right? Even, in other words, if you take as a baseline the highest GDP level that was attained in the Roaring 20s, you know, in the let's say December of 1928 or July of 1929, even relative to that baseline, the country was just enormously wealthier by the time we got into the mid 1940s than it had been before. Now, again, if you fill in the bracket, what were we wealthier in? Well, we were wealthier in automobiles and rubber supplies and precious metal supplies and war material. And then after that, as we converted over to civilian production, to washing machines and, you know, egg beaters and home appliances of various kinds, which, you know, are kind of embarrassing to sort of be excited about right now. But the point here is that, you know, the country had to do something massive and big, first in response to the Depression, and then in response, of course, to the threat of Nazism. And people didn't take that as like, oh, damn, you mean we're going to have to start gearing up to fight against Nazis? Crap, I was so happy before that. No, people just thought, look, this is something we urgently have to do. And it was talked about that way. It was framed as a mobilization on behalf of freedom, to sort of rescue freedom, to preserve the world against a racialist maniac and blah, blah, blah. And so people sort of thought of it as a good thing, even though it was unfortunate it was being forced on us by invading Nazis. But nevertheless, I mean, it was viewed as a good, and it ended up in a certain sense being a good. I mean, obviously not the death and the destruction, but the sort of the growth of the productive capacity of the country. Now, if all we do right now is just slightly change a few of the values of the variables, so to speak. So if we fill in the brackets, as I was sort of, to use the language I was using before, with, you know, green technology, improvements in human health, and improvements in health rescuing technologies, improvements in sustainable agriculture, improvements in environmental quality, both aesthetically and biologically or health-wise, instead of, you know, expanded B-29 bomber production or whatever. If we fill in the brackets with things that are more kind of positive, which of course is what the Green New Deal is all about, then what we're really talking about here is, again, massive opportunity, not cost. And it doesn't, in that sense, it's almost better if, like, China doesn't do it too, or, you know, other countries don't do it too, because it just means more, you know, bigger export markets for the US, when other countries sort of get wise and decide to start greenifying too. Not that that's actually a worry, because China is way ahead of us when it comes to taking the environment seriously. But again, sort of assuming things that the right wingers talk about sort of for the sake of argument, basically even accepting the terms of the debate that they lay down, it's just not accurate to sort of for anybody to think of this as a matter of costs that we have to try to minimize. It's actually just an immense, a wonderful opportunity. And, you know, now instead of fighting Nazis, we're fighting, you know, the burning of the planet. So it doesn't even have to be thought of as, you know, people having to kill people in order to sort of preserve a decent life. It's more a matter of people killing death in order to preserve a livable planet. So that, I mean, that I find that the most helpful way to think about it, the most helpful sort of approach to that question.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it is super helpful to be thinking about that. We're in also framing projects when we are doing our research, and how we're engaging and how we're talking about that. So to understand what the status quo framing is, and then, you know, pushing back on that. So that is super helpful. And hopefully we'll get actually into some of these maybe more meta conversations right now in the Q&A. We have about 10 minutes or so. And because we had such a large turnout, Marion and I changed. So we noted in the chat that we'll just be reading some questions, and I have some in the queue. So we'll see how many we get to. And then I am recording all of them. So I'm happy to send it to the speakers after if we don't get to everything. So the first question that I have here on the list by Forrest Klingerman, and the question was directed, well, I'll read it and then we'll see, and whoever wants to take it up. So Professor McGregor raised the need for a more holistic framework, which includes spiritual values and worldviews. So Forrest was interested to hear from Professor Twana about how transdisciplinary work might involve certain kinds of other, you know, value discussions, like within religious studies, for example, that might help scientists investigate this facet of communal and individual value creation. And I think Professor McGregor, in your answer to Marion's question, also helped expand and give that insight. So Nancy, I guess that's directed to you, but Bob, if you want to weigh in too.
Well, I think everyone should weigh in, but I agree completely with many of the points that Deborah was making about the importance of thinking about our cosmologies, not just our epistemic systems, and being attentive to our relationality. And I think we have to think there's lots of allies in this. I think about Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, in which she talks about the importance of building kin relations and thinking about relationality. And I would also challenge us to make sure that in our efforts to develop and move and adapt and green our society, that we don't lose track of I always think of Bishop Desmond Tutu's worry about climate apartheid and the ways in which a lot of the people who benefit from adaptation, even a lot of the people who benefit from greening industry, are not those who are the least well off. So we have to think in complex ways about both our relations to the environment and our relations amongst ourselves.
Professor McGregor, did you want to add to that response, and then Professor Hockett, if you wanted to?
All I would perhaps add to that is, I guess because I'm operating in the world of assessment at the moment, just because of what I'm doing every day, is I think I've come to the view that it already exists. Like when I think about when people are on the land, they're already assessing risk, vulnerability, they're already monitoring, they're doing all of that. But we just haven't, we didn't talk to them, and we didn't ask the right questions, and now we don't have it. Like it hasn't been mobilized to be able to influence these broader discussions. Like I'm in spaces where it's still that it is primitive people, they don't get it. If only they would take our solutions and get electric cars, even though it's a remote community and it's all dirt road, and there's no way that's going to work. So I think we just need to work, do the work of trying to bring that kind of knowledge to the fore. So I think it's already there. It's just how do we, for lack of a better word, mobilize it so it starts to influence what we do and the decisions, and it can get scaled up in the ways that Nancy and Robert talked about. So that's all I'll add to that, and keen to hear from Robert.
Yeah, I think what I would add is I'd be curious to see what you guys think of this, whether you think it's a wise way of proceeding or not. But I tend to kind of bifurcate, not as a matter of not, I don't dogmatically bifurcate, but it seems like practically speaking, a certain kind of bifurcation works well in my own sort of advocacy. And here's what I mean by that. The people who at present seem to be most skeptical about or most resistant to taking serious action to rescue the climate and rescue the planet don't seem to be initially amenable to appeals to their responsibilities to other people, let alone then to other species or to the planet. I'm very much a kind of a deep green type. I'm the total, when I was a philosopher in my earlier life, I did mainly mathematical logic and alternative logics. And so I came to the Routleys, who then later changed their names to the Sylvans through alternative logics. But then I ended up being quite taken with, again, the sort of deep green ethic that they began to articulate. And I consider myself essentially a deep green. But I also think that the types of folk I end up talking to who are, again, most resistant to the idea of a Green New Deal, at least initially, are not particularly amenable to appeals to deep green ethic. On the other hand, I think that if they actually begin to experience the world through something other than processed foodstuffs or through cable television or social media, if the environment around them, in other words, were actually cleaned and abated and allowed to become once again as beautiful as it was before our footprint began to be stamped on it, I think that the appeal will be quite seductive and they won't be able to resist it, you see, if that makes any sense. And so part of me, in consequence, when I refer to bifurcation, I think in terms of advocacy, I think, well, at this stage, while they're still basically experienced in the world through processed foods and social media and cigarette butts and all sorts of other junk that's all around them, the easiest way to appeal to them is to sort of appeal to other values rather than their responsibility to the environment or to others. But just like, wouldn't you like this to be a more prosperous place? Or wouldn't you like to be earning a better living, like a living wage, rather than, living hand to mouth and so forth? And then once we actually begin to make some practical headway so that their material circumstances are a little bit better, and they can then sort of viscerally appreciate the beauty of what we're trying to recover, rather than just having to hear it sort of verbally or through sophisticated argumentation. They might be more movable, so to speak. I'm a little ambivalent about adopting this sort of strategy because I feel a little bit like it's vaguely manipulative, but it might also just be a matter of kind of putting yourself where your listeners are, like trying to sort of be where your interlocutors are. And if some of them aren't living in beautiful Ithaca, in the way that I do for part of the year, they might not be as immediately movable by reference to some of the things that are moving us.
So I think we have time to squeeze in one more question. So we have a question from Abdel Hafid Jabri, and there's also some really great questions from Jorge Sanchez Perez and Britta Clark that I want to be able to send on to you. And if you have the time, or we can pass along some of those. But for the sake of time, I'm going to ask. So Abdel Hafid asks, or was wondering, if the fragmentation of knowledge into these different disciplines, right, philosophy, science, and so on, has kind of created an epistemological gap. And so current and future climate issues really then do seem to call for a type of interdisciplinarity in how we're doing our pedagogy and our research. So just a question as to where you see that and how we might be addressing that gap. And anyone can take it and we can hear from all of you.
Well, I'm nodding because I'm right there. I mean, I think you can't, this is, climate change is not an issue we can address from disciplines. It's an issue we have to address from lots of different perspectives, and we have to bring all of our skills to bear. And that's going to mean not only that we need transdisciplinary research, but it means we literally, as you all have suggested, need to get out in the field. And that brings many, many skills. And sometimes we need to be pragmatic. Robert, I think that's exactly what you were arguing for. We need to be pragmatic, but then we also need people that are always behind watching that pragmatic response to make sure that we're not making some people's lives and some species' lives much worse with our pragmatism.
Yeah, I agree with the observation because people don't experience the world in disciplines. I mean, academics do. As Nancy pointed out, our careers and everything else, but that's not how the world is experienced. And I like how Robert put it. Like, I sort of thought it has to be embodied. Once people start to experience it, then you start to kind of get it a little bit more. And that's where we can kind of swoop in and try to explain when there's just frustration and people are, what is going on? It's like, okay, I think I can help. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a helpful comment to finish with. So thank you.
Yeah, I would agree as well. I mean, we can even play on the somewhat glib use of the word existential in connection with climate change, right? I mean, usually people don't have a particularly philosophic meaning of that term in mind when they say that we're confronted with an existential challenge. But as it happens, it is not only existential in that kind of popular sense, but it's kind of existential in the more technical philosophic sense too. I wouldn't call myself a Heideggerian by any means, and I wouldn't have the requisite expertise to be Heideggerian or anti-Heideggerian. But one thing that I do have some exposure to is the idea of being as a kind of plenum, as a kind of full, not sort of given to us already sort of divvied up or sort of carved up into disciplines, but as a kind of a welter, a kind of, there's a thrownness into the world that we are confronted with in a certain sense. And it would be kind of nice if this place that we're thrown into isn't like on fire, if it actually becomes a kind of a friendly sort of place where we can kind of feel at home, or dare I say at home in the world. And, that does, it seemed to me, implicate all sorts of not just disciplines, but even just human involvements and human relations of all kinds, to our own cultures, to our own neighbors, to our fellow species, to the things growing around us. I mean, to everything. So it's about as holistic, it seems to me, a challenge, as it is an existential challenge. And for that very reason, it seems to me that we're really forced to be as just ruthlessly interdisciplinary here.
I love that all of you were touching on sort of this importance of phenomenological experiences, right, in all of this, and you know, this braiding together of these different epistemologies, and sort of this importance in movement. So I think that's, you know, exactly what we need to be grappling with, especially as we are emerging into the field, right, so to speak. Before I turn it over to close out, have Marian close us out, I did want to, from my perspective, thank all of you. And it's been really wonderful to be able to have this kind of discussion here. And we hope to keep these kinds of discussions moving forward. As a representative of the Climate Futures Initiative, I will be continuing to organize a number of events. And we do have one coming up in December. So if you're all interested, and it'll be some different kinds of hot takes, I would like to say, about COP26 and directions about where we're moving forward and going from there. So I'll put a link in the chat if you're all interested in that. And I will thank you all once again and turn it over to Marian to lead us out.
Yeah, I just wanted to, again, thank all our speakers, and thanks to the audience for being here and for your good questions that we unfortunately didn't get to all of, but we appreciate them, and hope to see you at a future event. And thanks again. So take care, everyone. Be safe.
Good evening, everyone.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you all.
Thanks
And
so much for
thanks
taking
to
the
all
time.
the audience for all the great questions. Email us if you'd like us to continue the conversation.
Yeah, please do.